The Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier, Kaga, once among Japan's most powerful warships, is about to face her ultimate test. Dawn has seen Kaga's aircrews launch a fierce strike against Midway, but now, hours later, the tide of battle is turning. Alert sirens wail across the carrier's decks as enemy aircraft swarm down from the skies. Within minutes, this proud carrier will be fighting for her life. Explore Kaga's transformation, wartime role, and final hours at Midway in one of the most pivotal naval clashes of World War II. Laid down in 1921 as a 39,900-ton Tosa-class battleship, the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty halted new battleship construction, and when the partially built battlecruiser Amagi was wrecked by an earthquake in 1923, Japan chose Kaga's sturdy hull as a replacement to convert into an aircraft carrier. Work proceeded slowly. Kaga was not fully commissioned until 1928, but she emerged as one of the IJN's first large fleet carriers. Uniquely, her original design featured 3 stacked flight decks, an experimental layout shared only with her sister, Kagi. The main flight deck spanned most of the ship's length, while 2 shorter decks stepped down forward, intended to allow simultaneous takeoffs and landings. In theory, it maximized launch capacity, but as aircraft grew larger and heavier in the 1930s, the 2 lower decks proved too short to be practical and were eventually plated over during a major reconstruction. Between 1933 and 1935, Kaga underwent an extensive modernization to keep her competitive. Her flight deck was extended to about 815 feet, greater than the ship's overall length of 812 feet, and her hangars were expanded, increasing aircraft capacity from around 60 to 90 planes, 72 operational, 18 in reserve. A small island superstructure was added, after operating for years with no island at all, and her inefficient smoke ducts were replaced by a single large downturned funnel on the starboard side. Kaga's propulsion was completely upgraded. New boilers and turbines boosted her output from 91,000 to 127,000 shaft horsepower, nudging her top speed to about 28 knots, still slightly slower than Akagi, but a marked improvement. To compensate for added weight aloft, her hull was lengthened and fitted with additional torpedo bulges for stability. Kaga's gun armament reflected her origins. Initially, she carried 4 twin 8-inch guns in casemates for defense, though some were removed in the rebuild. By the late 1930s, she was equipped with a suite of 127mm 5-inch dual-purpose guns and multiple 25mm anti-aircraft guns to fend off aerial threats. Despite these upgrades, design weaknesses remained. Kaga's aviation fuel tanks were built into the ship's structure without extra protection. Any heavy shock or hit could crack them and leak gasoline. Her hangar decks were fully enclosed, which allowed dangerous fuel vapors to accumulate and made fire containment difficult, especially since Japanese carrier doctrine was to fuel and arm aircraft below decks whenever possible. Her wooden flight and hangar decks lacked armor plating, and her fire suppression systems were essentially redundant. In short, a single bomb hit in the wrong spot could unleash an uncontrollable inferno. These flaws, not corrected in her rebuild, would later prove fateful. Yet on the eve of the Pacific War, Kaga was still a formidable warship, a 38,000-ton giant carrying the Emperor's sword far across the seas. Kaga's early career helped pioneer Japan's naval air power. In 1932, her aircraft saw combat in the Shanghai Incident, providing air support to Japanese troops in China. Throughout the late 1930s, Kaga participated in the Second Sino-Japanese War, launching strikes against Chinese targets and refining carrier tactics. By 1941, she formed part of the IJN's elite First Air Fleet, the Kido Butai. On December 7, 1941, Kaga took part in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In the pre-dawn hours, her decks thundered as Kaga sent off part of the first wave of 183 planes bound for Oahu. Kaga's aviators claimed hits on multiple US battleships, including Arizona, Oklahoma, and Nevada, and strafed airfields across the island. The attack was a staggering success that crippled the US Pacific Fleet and announced the dawn of carrier warfare. After recovering her aircraft, Kaga returned safely to Japanese waters, her crew elated and confident. In the months that followed, Kaga ranged across the Pacific as Japan's offensive rolled on. In January 1942, she supported the invasion of Rabaul in the Bismarck Archipelago. The next month, Kaga's air group joined a massive carrier raid on Darwin, Australia, where Japanese bombers sank ships and wrecked port facilities on February 19, 1942. As Japanese forces advanced into the Dutch East Indies, Kaga's planes struck targets in Java and assisted in destroying Allied naval units attempting to escape. However, operating at such frenetic pace took its toll. In early February 1942, while maneuvering through the shallow waters off Palau, Kaga ran aground on an uncharted reef, damaging her hull. She carried this damage during the strikes on Darwin and continued operations through the Java campaign despite the damage, but by March, the carrier was sent back to Japan for repairs. This forced Kaga to miss the April 1942 Indian Ocean raid, where her sister ships struck British bases, a rare absence that kept her out of that victory. By late May 1942, repairs were complete, and Kaga rejoined Admiral Nagumo's carrier task force for Japan's next bold operation, the strike on Midway Atoll. Kaga had thus far been a cornerstone of Japan's string of triumphs, from Pearl Harbor to the East Indies. Now she steamed east once more, part of a 4-carrier flotilla, with Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, aiming to deliver a decisive blow to the United States Navy. Unbeknownst to her crew, however, the Americans had intercepted Japan's plans. As Kaga headed toward Midway, the US Pacific Fleet quietly lay in wait, setting the stage for a climactic confrontation. In the early hours of June 4th, 1942, Kaga and 3 other Japanese carriers reached their launch point northwest of Midway. Before dawn, the order was given to strike. Kaga's flight deck came alive with activity as she launched a portion of the first wave attack on Midway Atoll. Dozens of her bombers and fighters joined those from Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu in swooping over Midway's airfields at sunrise, bombing runways and installations in an effort to crush the island's defenses. By 7 a.m., as Kaga's first wave planes returned, reports indicated that Midway's airstrips were cratered but not completely neutralized. The Japanese carriers began preparing a second strike. Below decks, Kaga's ordnance crews hurriedly rearmed and refueled aircraft for another attack on the island, and potentially to arm for an anti-ship strike if any American fleet was spotted. This resulted in Kaga's hangars and flight deck being cluttered with torpedoes, bombs, and fueled aircraft, creating a highly volatile situation. As the Japanese focused on turnaround operations, Midway's own defenders struck back. Between 7:10 and 8:30, waves of Midway-based American aircraft, Marine Corps Dauntless dive bombers, Army B-17s, and Navy torpedo planes made desperate attacks on Nagumo's carrier formation. Kaga and her companions went to full evasive action, twisting at high speed and throwing up intense anti-aircraft fire. Kaga's gunners joined with those on other ships, filling the sky with flak bursts. Fortunately for the Japanese, these piecemeal raids were uncoordinated and largely ineffective. Bombs from high-flying B-17s fell wide of their marks, and ill-fated torpedo runs by antiquated American planes were defeated by aggressive maneuvering. Not a single hit was scored on Kaga or the other carriers during these initial attacks. The threat, however, kept Nagumo's forces on the defensive and delayed the launch of their own counterstrike. By 9 a.m., with the Midway air attacks repelled, Kaga's deck crews were nearly ready to launch a refreshed strike force. The atmosphere was tense, but cautiously optimistic. The carriers had endured the morning's scares and were about to hit back. At that moment, lookouts spotted new attackers incoming. Around 9:20, American carrier-based TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from USS Hornet and Enterprise, soon followed by Yorktown Squadron, were sighted skimming low over the waves. These slow-moving torpedo planes pressed in towards Kaga's task force from multiple directions. Immediately, Kaga's bridge shouted orders for hard turns. The carrier heeled over in a sharp zigzag as her helmsman and those of the other ships tried to comb the torpedo tracks. Meanwhile, Japan's combat air patrol of Zero fighters pounced at wave-top height. The Zeros roared in to intercept the Devastators, chewing into them with cannon and machine gun fire. One by one, the American torpedo planes were shot down or forced into the sea, many never managing to release their torpedoes. Kaga evaded the few torpedoes that did get dropped. Not a single one struck home. To the Japanese crews, it looked as if they had narrowly escaped disaster by skill and daring. But this frantic low-altitude melee had an unintended consequence. The defending Zero fighters were drawn far out of position, chasing kills near the ocean surface while leaving the skies above the fleet virtually unguarded. At 10:25, disaster came screaming down from those unguarded skies. Nearly 36 US Navy SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise CV-6 and Yorktown CV-5 suddenly appeared high above Kaga's formation. Exploiting the distraction of the torpedo attack, they had approached unseen and now dove almost vertically out of the sun. The carriers were still cranked hard over from evading torpedoes, leaving her steaming in a tight curve that made an ideal target. Pilots from Enterprise's air group zeroed in on the huge vessel below. A swarm of dive bombers hurtled earthward toward Kaga. Then, in an instant, the bombs were released. The first bomb whistled down, punching through the forward flight deck. It detonated deep in the hangar, among a host of fully fueled Zero fighters being readied for launch. The explosion was devastating. It ignited fuel and munitions in a chain reaction that blew out sections of the hangar. A ferocious blast of fire and pressure raced through the bowels of the ship. Almost simultaneously, more bombs struck home. Another dive bomber planted a bomb directly into Kaga's midsection. It hit near the base of the ship's island superstructure and exploded with cataclysmic force. This blast ripped through the upper decks, killing Kaga's senior officers and staff gathered in the island and nearby command spaces. Other bombs followed in rapid succession. Eyewitness accounts suggest that Kaga absorbed at least 4 to 5 direct hits in minutes. One by one, these heavy bombs punched through her wooden flight deck and burst inside her hangars, which were crammed with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. Each detonation triggered secondary explosions as ordnance blew apart and gasoline flashed into fireballs. Sailors later recalled that the ship ceased to exist as an organized entity almost immediately. She was transformed into a blazing wreck. Enormous blasts racked the carrier as fires touched off ammunition stores. Fragments of the ship and aircraft debris rained into the sea around her. The once proud carrier was now an inferno. Aboard Kaga, damage control teams fought to contain the conflagration, but it was hopeless. The fires had free rein in the enclosed hangars, and firefighting systems had been wrecked by the blasts. In the first moments after the hits, hundreds of Kaga's crew, especially mechanics and aviators on the hangar decks, were killed outright or incapacitated by the blasts and toxic smoke. Many others were trapped below as raging fires and heat made sections of the ship impassable. With communications lost and flames spreading unchecked, Kaga's captain, Jisaku Okada, realized the ship could not be saved. He ordered the crew to begin abandoning ship. Destroyers of the escort closed in to assist and pick up survivors from the water. For several hours, Kaga remained aflame and drifting, a charnel ship stubbornly refusing to sink. The crew's evacuation continued in the afternoon, with destroyers rescuing whom they could. By late day, Kaga was a burning hulk, her interior gutted and her steel decks glowing red hot from the intense heat. Finally, as evening fell on June 4th, the Imperial Japanese Navy made the grim decision to scuttle her. Around 7:25 p.m., the destroyer Hagekaze closed to point-blank range and fired 2 torpedoes into Kaga's hull. In a muffled roar and rush of bubbles, the torpedoes struck home. The massive carrier began to sink, stern first. water swamped her aft hangar and flight deck, and within minutes, Kaga slid beneath the waves, disappearing into the deep. Hundreds of her sailors went down with the ship. Of Kaga's complement of 1,340 crew, over 811 perished. The destruction of Kaga at Midway was part of a disaster from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. In the span of a single day, Japan lost 4 frontline carriers, which together had formed the core of its offensive striking power. Along with the ships went over 3,000 Japanese personnel, including a large portion of the elite aviators and flight deck crews that had spearheaded the Pacific offensive. These losses were catastrophic. Kaga and her sister ships had been the vanguard of Japan's naval air arm, crucial to the victories of 1941 to 42. Now they were gone, taking with them Japan's hopes of regaining the initiative. Strategically, Midway proved to be the turning point of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy, so dominant in the early months of the war, was crippled by the Midway carrier losses. Japan's capacity to project fast, carrier-based power was sharply reduced, and perhaps more critically, it lacked the industrial base and reserves of trained aircrew to quickly replace what had been lost. In the aftermath, Japan had to cancel or delay major operations and shift to a defensive stance. Within weeks of Midway, Allied forces began launching their first counteroffensive at Guadalcanal, an offensive Japan struggled to oppose without adequate carrier cover. Meanwhile, the United States, having lost only one carrier, Yorktown at Midway, could make good its losses with relentless shipbuilding. By 1943 to 44, new Essex-class fleet carriers and veteran US airmen would arrive in ever-growing numbers, tilting the balance irrevocably in the Allies' favour. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the psychological blow was just as profound. The sinking of Kaga and her consorts shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the Kido Butai. These were the very carriers that 6 months earlier had attacked Pearl Harbor with impunity. Their annihilation at Midway was a harsh lesson in the changing nature of warfare, showing that even the mightiest carriers could be humbled by superior intelligence and air power. Japanese naval leadership initially tried to suppress the news. Kaga's surviving crew members were kept in isolation upon returning to Japan, forbidden from contacting family or speaking of the battle, in an effort to conceal the extent of the defeat from the Japanese public. But, as months passed and no grand victories followed, the truth became apparent. In Kaga's 14 years of service, she had been a key instrument of Japan's early conquests, from China to Southeast Asia, and a testament to the nation's innovative adaptation of a battleship into a cutting-edge carrier. Her demise at Midway, however, underscored the vulnerability of those very carriers in the face of modern air power. After Midway, Japan would never again hold the naval supremacy it once enjoyed. The great carrier that had carried Japan's ambitions on her decks was now a tomb on the Pacific floor, a somber monument to the high price of waging an aggressive war.